I'm not sure Paul had to deal with Zoom and internet issues though, so maybe it was easier back then than today. But we'll hope everything runs smoothly here for the rest of this time. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about Paul and two of my favorite places to visit, Greece and Turkey. So I've got some slides to show you as well as we talk about all of this. But Turkey particularly is one of my favorite places to visit, and it's got such a rich history and there's so much going on. And while I know you're reading the Philippians letter, which is in Greece, Paul spent a good bit of his time in Turkey on his way to get there to work with the Philippians. So I think it helps give us some sense of Paul and what he was dealing with. This is one of my favorite places in Turkey, interior Turkey. Anybody been to Turkey in this group?
Yeah.
This is a calcium hot springs built. There's a city built here on top of the hill beside it, Hierapolis, and it's probably very likely that Paul passes through here on his third missionary journey. And then just looking out over the Lycus River Valley, the home to Colossae and Laodicea. And if you continue on down, you'll eventually reach Ephesus. And so this is probably someplace Paul would have passed through. And so it's always kind of intriguing to ponder what that would have been like at the time. If you're really eager to experience this, I do know that they offer hiking trips through Turkey where they actually visit all of the Pauline sites, and you camp and walk along just as Paul did. Hundreds of miles, though. I encourage you to get yourself in shape before that excursion. But yeah, the world that Paul came into with his efforts, I always wonder about this calling them missionary efforts. I'm not sure he would understand what that term meant at the time, but he's certainly active in trying to spread the message that he has now received. And I think first and foremost, when we think about Paul and this time in the world, a couple things to keep in mind. Tom Wright, or NT, I believe you guys are looking at his book, says first and foremost, you have to think of Paul in his Jewishness, and that while he has embraced the way of Jesus, he always was and continued to be Jewish. And I think that's important to realize. In all of these cities and places he goes, the first thing he does is he goes to either the synagogues or he tries to find a group of Jews or God-fearers. And I think in Philippi, you've probably already talked about that, but the first thing he does when he gets there on the Sabbath is he looks for a group of women praying he finds by the river, who's going to lead him to eventually Lydia, who, as you said, is kind of considered the first European convert to this new religion, if you want to call it that. That's the other interesting thing to think about at this time. Most anybody outside of Judaism, as they would have seen this movement grow, would have only seen it as another sect within Judaism. They would never have seen it as something totally new and separate. And that's always one of the difficulties as we read Paul, I think, and look at things going on at the time is what do we do with these two traditions that have now developed? You have the Jewish tradition, you've got this Christian tradition, and Wright in some other works actually indicates that there's this strong sense with Paul that he doesn't see the need for a break between the two in some ways. He still kind of clings to his Jewish identity. At various points, he talks about, he's the most Jewish of Jewish people you can encounter, for sure. Also, the thing to keep in mind, of course, is that we're in the midst of the Roman Empire now. It's been an empire for roughly 100 years, not quite. And so everything he does and encounters is, one is with Judaism, and then two is with Rome and Roman officials. And he's trying to kind of steer a path between all of these things, and he finds himself, I think, quite challenged in that regard. As Rome is trying to change everyone's identity, in a sense, to incorporate them into that system, we find that we have to understand the Roman Empire pretty well to know what's going on. And we realize pretty quickly, even with Paul, that the empire is very cosmopolitan, very diverse, all kinds of people. And this is why I think the use of Koine Greek that he uses with his letters and with the New Testament becomes so important, because that was the language for trade and travel around the Mediterranean world at the time. It's not the same as classical Greek. It's much more of just kind of the common man's Greek. If you were going to rent your chariot in Philippi, when you showed up there for getting off the boat, you'd talk to the agent there at the desk in Koine Greek, probably, just as you would if you were, say, in Alexandria, Egypt, or in Antioch, would be the case. Also, this society is very urban oriented. And so everywhere Paul goes, of course, he's going to the cities. And early on, Christianity is focused on urban ministries and focused on the cities. Without a doubt, that becomes an important part of everything he does, is working in the cities. This is where the idea of pagan develops, because pagan, a Latin word, which means the word pagani means hill people, the hillbillies, in a sense, were the pagans. And so the people who weren't in the cities do not get introduced to Christianity as soon. And so Paul kind of passes through a lot of these regions and travels long ways and periods of time to get to these major cities where he's focused. It's also a world of great inequalities in terms of the wealth. And I think much of what Paul is talking about, in a sense, in certain places, is trying to emphasize the fact that we can't be oppressing those who are not the same as us. And this whole notion of trying to draw everyone together, this is one of the attractions, I think, of Christianity at the time, was it's kind of egalitarian nature. And Paul works hard on that. But of course, because of that, you get people from all these different cultures and places I've talked about, and that leads to a lot of divisiveness. So all of these letters Paul writes are really focused on trying to avoid that divisiveness. The other thing is, this is a very superstitious world, it's a very religious world. And so these people recognize that there are what they would call the demons throughout the air. The spirits of the air are everywhere. And in the Greco-Roman world, that could be both good and bad. There were those spirits that did good things. And so there would be incantations and little trinkets that you would have for gods and goddesses to give you good crops, to make your business prosper, to make your wife fertile. This was just so much a part of the spirit of the air at the time. Plus, there was those demons that did bad things. And so one of the things that's really empowering about Christianity was it develops these practices like baptism and things and Eucharist to give people a sense that those demons no longer had any kind of control or power over them. And so Paul is really wanting to emphasize this, to give people the sense of freedom, that those things no longer dominated their lives. And so I think we have to keep all of those things kind of in mind here. But like I say, this is interior Turkey. When we look at his travels, I know this map looks a little crazy. I'll look at each one individually, but just to give you a broad picture, you have, of course, there on the right-hand side, the home territory, Judea. Farther north, you have Antioch, which really becomes the sending point for Paul. Tarsus up there, his hometown. And then he finds his way working on up into Turkey or Asia Minor, the region of Galatia, Phrygia, over to Ephesus, north to Troas. Troas is actually just Troy, next to the ancient city of Troy. And then, of course, he crosses over into Europe and finds his way in Greece, landing at the port city of Neapolis for Philippi. And you're working on that as well. And then he eventually will work his way south down to Athens and Corinth. So just to give you some general sense of where all we're talking about here, this is the city of Antioch, which is the place they were first called Christians. Hard to imagine what it might have looked like then, but I think there's still some similarities there. It's a coastal city, fairly populated still to this day. As you can see, there's a minaret there, and it's definitely more a Muslim-dominated city now than it was then. This city really makes you feel like you're in the Middle East when you're in Antioch. It's right on the border with Syria. It's in Turkey, but it's right on the Syrian border. And I haven't been back there since 2009. Um, Most parents are not eager to send their students to the Syrian border these days with all that's been going on in Syria, so we don't go down there anymore. Hopefully someday in the future. This is the remnants of a cave church there in Antioch, just a few of the Christian remnants there. They're very difficult to find in Antioch, which in Turkey is now called Iskender in Turkish, which actually means Alexander. And this was a city that Alexander the Great had passed through and been a part of. And then it's one of his successors, Antiochus, for whom the city is named. But it's from there he starts his first missionary journey, sailing to Cyprus and then working his way up into Turkey. And really the first prominent place he goes to is Antioch in Pisidia, which you see there. And Antioch there, very important city. Really the first sermon we have from Paul comes from Antioch in Pisidia. And then he makes his way to Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, and back to Antioch. That whole area is the area of Galatia, for whom the letter to the Galatians was written. It's those churches. Roughly from the coast to Antioch, about 100, 150 miles. Lystra, another 100 miles. Derbe, almost 100. So he's covering a lot of ground there. This is where it gets really interesting for me as I travel to these places. Is I showed you Antioch, and I think Middle East, and I think desert and dry and remote. And then you get into Turkey, and this is Pisidian Antioch, and this is the view from the main city entrance. And the whole notion of snow-capped peaks, mountains, is just not what I ever imagined until I had first been there. And it's a pretty amazing, it's one of my favorite stops. It's very remote now, not much there. At the time, it was a very prominent city in the Roman world, kind of controlling the passageway from the mountains of the coast up into central Turkey. And then during the Roman period, it was a very prominent city, hence why Paul visits there. Just to give you another idea, these are the ruins of the Church of St. Paul there. Of course, it wasn't there when he was there, it was built later, but they built a church named after him, and it became a very important church in the Byzantine era there in central Turkey. It's a beautiful part of the country, more of the remains of the church there. And then that's the city as it sits today. And so I always imagine, what Paul would have felt like as he enters the city, as he and Barnabas are there, and they're encountering Roman officials, but they're also dealing with the Jews there. And of course, if you know the story, there is where the Jews become jealous of the popularity of Paul and Barnabas, and in the end, they shake the dust off their shoes and move on because the way they're being treated there. And so they go from there to Lystra, then to Derbe. Lystra to the south and east, a place where the people confused them with being Roman gods, thinking they were Zeus and Hermes. Thinking Barnabas was Zeus and Paul was Hermes, because Paul's always doing all the talking. And so there you see that pulling together kind of Roman culture and religion and superstition. And these people who spoke with such authority and power must be, in a sense, gods in a sense. So they find their way there, more of Paul. Then they end up in Iconium. Mm-hmm. And Iconium is the modern day city of Konya. And there really isn't much there in terms of Christian remnants anymore. Konya becomes a very important center in Islamic circles, as it's the home of Rumi, the Sufi mystics, and that whole movement. This is his tomb, actually, where Rumi is. Rumi is known for, of course, the development of the whirling dervishes. This is where their home is from. But this was originally the city of Iconium, a place that Paul had spent a good bit of time as well. So it's always kind of been a spiritual center in Turkey, Christianity. This a whole other story that would be fun to trace is the development from Turkey, central Turkey, going from being almost 80 to 90% Christian by the 5th, 6th century to now, in a sense, almost no Christians at all in central Turkey any longer. And that transition and what that means is it's a pretty fascinating, if not tragic and sad story, for sure. But this is the whole whirling dervish tradition, by the way, is actually the practice of a centering prayer. That as you're spinning, you're praying, and the spinning and the focus on the foot that's down is part of a spiritual practice of centering prayer and all of that. That's just some more of. And so here we see again now the second journey that Paul's going to take, again leading out from Antioch, passing through his hometown of Tarsus, then returning again to the churches there in Galatia, of Derbe, Iconium, Lystra, and Antioch. Of course, he writes his letter, the book of Galatians, to those churches, and that's probably his first letter. And in a sense, that would make the book of Galatians the first written Christian document. The New Testament starts in terms of age of documents with the letters of Paul are actually in written form earlier than the Gospels. Not all of them, but Galatians for sure, very early. So he's writing letters to these first churches that he establishes there in that part of the world. And then for whatever reason, Acts tells us that the Holy Spirit prevents him from staying in Asia. So he passes on over to the north and ends up in Troas. And as I said, Troas is just Troy. That's where that is located. And it's there that he has this vision to go to Macedonia and to Philippi. But this is the region passing through from Antioch. If he would have been passing west, this is basically what it would look like as you travel across that part of the world. Huge plains surrounded by these mountains. And these would be the mountains you would pass through to go back down to Tarsus and the Mediterranean. Sorry, these are a little blurry. I took these on the bus while we were passing through, but just to give you some sense of the landscape there. This was a very common travel route, and even on into the Middle Ages, you have the development of these caravan stops on the Silk Roads and things in the same area where people would stop at nighttime as they traveled across the country. You take your animals in here, you sleep there overnight, and then get up the next morning and pass on. Some of the places Paul might have gone by, most likely Colossae. It's questionable whether he ever does much there, but he's very aware of the church and the community there. Sadly, there's been no excavation, no archaeology done at Colossae yet. It's just a big hill covered with weeds and lots of pot shards and a sign to indicate that that's where it is, but there's nothing else there. The other important city passing through here is Laodicea. A prominent city for Paul, prominent city in the book of Revelation and John's Revelation, talked about. Again, just to give you a sense of the terrain in that part of the world, they're doing a lot of work at Laodicea, actually trying to put the church back together there. And in fact, this is the early baptismal at the church in Laodicea, and recognizing that baptisms were generally not done in a public forum at the time because you were usually baptized in the nude at that point. And so it was in this more enclosed area, men baptizing men, women baptizing women, usually kneeling, and triune baptism. You would be plunged in 3 times. And this is the baptistry that they found there at the church at Laodicea.
Gary, what year is that? What year is that?
That church is 5th century.
Okay, cool.
400s.
So kind of post-Constantine.
There. It's a beautiful part of the world, I have to say. This is the remains of the amphitheater at Laodicea. And then you can see off in the distance, the whites on the hills. That's the calcium hot springs I showed you earlier. That's Hierapolis up there. And so this whole area is known for its hot springs and the cold and the warm water that comes out of the springs. This is interesting because in the book of Revelation, in this area, he talks about them being lukewarm, and water temperature is tied into that. Plus, in Laodicea, it was famous for in the hot springs, the mud, the sand that came up was used as an eye ointment. And in fact, in the book of Revelation, one of the things that John mentions is eyesight and not seeing clearly. And often commentators have made reference to the fact that he may be, in a sense, tying into that whole notion of how they understood themselves in that regard. This is Hierapolis. This is where the calcium hot springs are, the amphitheater there. This one they've actually rebuilt, and people perform there, orchestras and things. And then again, you can see off in the Lycus River Valley down below. Eventually you would get to Ephesus if you head down that way. And so here we are at Ephesus, again, also a very important city for Paul on second and third missionary journeys. Spends a good bit of time there. I don't know who this guy is. He keeps popping up in all my pictures. He clearly thinks too highly of himself. That's the facade to the library. Ephesus was famous for its library, among other things. And so that would have been the front of the library. And here's looking down at it from another angle. To the left are the hill villas where the wealthy would have lived in the city of Ephesus. Then you have the library down there. And then off in the distance would have been the port. And Ephesus was a very important port city, but over time, which is the case with a lot of these cities, those areas silted in and they could no longer get ships to the city. So they abandoned the cities. One of the reasons why these places don't have people there anymore. Ephesus, an important center in the Roman world. And it's interesting because here is the newsstand on the main passage in Ephesus. And on the left-hand side here, you had stone tablets reporting on what's going on in Latin. And then further down to the right, it would be in Greek, giving you a sense of the kind of the cosmopolitan nature of this world. You actually have both of these languages being presented to the people in terms of news and information that would be posted there. Maybe even the chariot racing outcomes and things like that you could check on to see how your team had done. This is one of the most fascinating parts of Ephesus. This is on the stairway up to the library there. And maybe you'll notice, but that's a menorah carved into the steps. And it's believed that this was indicating and pointing towards the direction of where the Jews met in Ephesus, where the synagogue was. And again, everywhere Paul goes, this is what he's looking for. These are the people he's looking for. Another interesting part of Roman culture, the public latrines. You might go every morning, you'd go spend your time there on the holes, on the spots. And usually somebody that would stand in there in the middle, either performing and or reading the newspaper for you while you started your day. So an interesting approach for sure. And then you have a little trough there down at your feet with running water that was used to keep things clean, if you will. These are some of the houses in Ephesus, the floor, the walls, the mosaic on the floor, the lion, just to give you an idea of what it was like living during those times. And then this is the amphitheater in Ephesus. And if you know the story of Ephesus at all, of course, it's here that Paul stirs up quite a riot. And the people, of course, everything rests on money. And the fear was that the money that was made there by the selling of religious icons of Artemis or Diana, which was really an important part of the economy, was being disrupted by these followers of Paul. And so it's into this arena that all the people march and start a riot. And Paul wanted to go into this place to kind of quell things. And his smarter friends say, no, look, there's a lot of people in there. You're not going to have a good go if you go in there. And so this would have been the amphitheater full of people basically cheering for Paul's head at this point. And cooler minds prevailed and got him out of the city. And he ended up not going in there. This is the remains of the Church of St. John in Ephesus, which was built in the 5th century as well. It rivaled the Hagia Sophia in size at the time. Very important church. John, of course, the beloved disciple, Ephesus was the place where he ends up going and beginning his ministry. So John had already been in place in Ephesus even before Paul got there. And then the temple to Artemis, Diana, there in Ephesus. And this statue was a very important part of the culture there and ties into the whole idea of how important religion was in this world. And fertility goddess, hard to make sense of what all this means, but lots of little statuettes of this figure were a big part of the life in Ephesus. He eventually passes on and goes to Troas, or the remains of Troy. And it's here that he receives his vision to go to Philippi. There's not much left there. A lot of pieces of pottery. They're still working on uncovering things there. Lots of inscriptions on stones there. And then you have the port below Troas of Assos, also an important part of this journey. Assos sits up above the Aegean Sea. You can look out across at the island of Lesbos there. This is also the place where Aristotle tutored for a while, including Alexander the Great. We talk about the ultimate homeschool situation. You have Alexander the Great being tutored at home by Aristotle. It's almost like having Dr. St. Antoine tutor your children. And then you can see the port down below. It's from there that Paul sets sail from here to go to Macedonia and to Philippi. Now, I haven't been to Philippi, so I have to apologize. I have no good pictures there, but we did make it to Athens, and just so some sense of Greece at this point. You can see here on top of the Acropolis, the Pantheon, then down below the Agora, important parts of Athens. This is the Areopagus, the place where Paul meets with, he talks about meeting with, he goes to his place and the Epicureans and the Stoics, philosophers, are there talking. And it's there he presents his message about the unknown God that they're talking about. And so here we are kind of reenacting that. And you can again see Tom, St. Antoine up there, totally mesmerized by the preaching of one of our colleagues as he sits up there with his cap at the top of the hill in Athens. And then we also made our way to Corinth. And Corinth is a very important city at this time. It had been destroyed earlier by the Romans because it had been so rebellious and then rebuilt. And it always was an important city because it sits on the isthmus between the Greek mainland and the Peloponnesus. And so everybody and everything passes through there. Trade, travel, ideas, everything. Very cosmopolitan city, a very important site for Paul to go as well. Here, actually, they now have ships can sail between the two. They've made a canal there, but at the time that did not exist. And so you would transport goods back and forth. So basically from the Adriatic to the Aegean, this is the passageway. And so that would have all happened. But this is what's left of the city of Corinth. I think we have Dr. St. Antoine yawning here at this presentation. He's totally mesmerized, and then back up behind the city and what that area of Greece looked like. And then at the end of all his travels, when he finally comes back home, he lands at Caesarea, is where he sails back to. Again, a very important city built by Herod the Great in the 1st century BC. Here's where Peter baptizes the centurion, and it was an essential port city. And again, cities, Roman, all of these things coming together here in this city. This was actually the circus here where the chariot racing would have occurred in the city. The baths were actually situated to utilize salt water there. Not much left of the city, but it was pretty significant. And then his third missionary journey, as you can see here, again, traveling through some of the same places, again back through Galatia, again visiting, probably visiting Laodicea, Hierapolis, making it to Ephesus, back to Troas and Assos. All of that you can see in this map. And of course, then it all culminates finally with his return to Jerusalem, where he gets imprisoned and sent back to Rome. Just to take a slight detour real quick, because it's Turkey and I love to talk Turkey. This is the Hagia Sophia from the outside, Istanbul, inside. What I really wanted to touch on real quick here was one of my favorite places in all of Turkey, a place I think you all will recognize in a sense of its importance, is Nicaea, where the First Ecumenical Council is held, and the site where the creed is developed. And so it was in May of 325, Constantine invites all these church leaders to come up to his summer palace to wrestle with the issue of the divinity of Christ. And they get there, and this is what they find. He puts them up at his summer palace in the mountains on a lake, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. And we hear them spending weeks wrestling with theological issues. And I thought how serious these guys were until I went to Nicaea. And then I got there and I walked along the water there, and I got to thinking, yes, this was an important theological discussion, but here you've been invited to spend some time at the summer palace in the mountains on this lake. I'm not so sure that they were in the biggest hurry to make that decision about the nature of Christ, and we're eager to spend some time there. This is the remains of the Church of the Hagia Sophia there in Nicaea. And there's that guy again talking about the development of the Nicene Creed, but I can't not read the creed now and not think about this place and these people who were there at the time hammering out those issues in such a beautiful setting. I'm going to stop there. I probably talked too long as it is. Hopefully that gives you some background, and maybe you have some questions or things as well. I'd be happy to embrace those as well. Arnie, I see you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. This was absolutely fabulous. Do you teach a course that we can attend by Zoom?
I don't right now, no. And well, I do, but we're zooming out anymore. We're not going to be doing as much Zoom. I don't have any Zoom classes currently coming up. No.
Well, do you have classes that we can attend, for pay?
We could probably find something that we could work out, or maybe you just get RJ. We'll just do a whole section of Christian history classes or something at the church.
I would so love this.
I would be open to anything like that as well.
That'd be great. Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a couple of questions. One was, I was struck as you were showing pictures of those churches, just the centrality of the baptismal font. We have a beautiful baptismal font in our church, but it's kind of, in one of the ancillary chapels. Yeah. And it does seem like, in our day and age, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, seems to be the primary, the central sacrament. But just those, I was struck by those baptismal fonts, and I just didn't know if you had anything to say about that, about sort of the two magisterial sacraments, right? Like baptism and the Lord's Supper, and yeah, I don't know, maybe the primacy of one versus the other in the early church.
That's a good question. I think you're probably right. I think you would, the whole baptismal practice, again, in that superstitious world of that they lived in, the sense that baptism sealed you, from those powers from that point, made it such a pivotal part of your faith transition. They even went through a process of exorcism, pre-baptismal exorcisms. People were exorcised through Lent leading up to baptism, which usually occurred on Easter Sunday. And I think being on Easter also made it such a central part of Christian life. Eucharist, of course, Greek, Eucharisto, just means thanksgiving in a sense. So that was just kind of a continual, not to demean it in any way, but it was a continual practice of thanksgiving and recognition of what the sacrifice of Christ meant. But yeah, you're probably right in terms of it being such a one-time pivotal event in your faith life. Baptism, I'm hesitant to put one above the other for sure, but
no,
yeah.
I think it's fair to say right now, I don't want to say communion is something we do every week, and you go into our church, for example, and the altar is front and center, like you can't possibly miss it, and the baptismal font is a little bit off to the side, and so it's important, but it doesn't have the same visual primacy at Holy Trinity that I see, it has in some of these early churches. I just thought that was interesting.
When you look at
also
that,
many of the baptisms still at that point were more of the adult variety than infant baptism. Not that that didn't happen too. That's a little bit later development.
But also when you look at having it in the middle like that, it's really, and for that time of this faith, great branding. I mean, to have all these people, probably people of notoriety, being baptized front and center, is a great way to promote faith.
Yeah.
Christian population still quite large in Turkey?
No. At most, a very positive estimate would be 5% of the population, if that. And the farther east you go, the lesser it gets. Some of the major cities in the west, like Izmir on the coast, that part of Turkey is much more Western, much more European. Even Istanbul still has churches, and there are some fairly active Christian communities there, but they are far and away the minority at this point, yes.
So Dr. Poe, what would you say from all your travels, in that part of the world, if there was to be one or two big takeaways for you, or ways that it affected your reading of the New Testament, your understanding of Paul's ministry, your understanding of the faith, like what do you feel like is how do you understand your faith differently now, having traveled there, than you did before?
That's tough. I guess partly just the sense of now when you read the New Testament or some other documents, the creed, immediately I have an image in my head. I have a smell that I remember, sounds we heard. It just tends to make it all more alive, more real, I guess, in a certain sense. Plus, people pass through my vision that I can remember that I met there, or that we encountered. And I don't think I included it here, but I have a picture of a guy who's actually swimming in the lake there, who swam over to us and just started talking to us when we were in Nicaea. And just the notion of people, that these are people, and this would have been the same encounter that Paul would have had as he traveled through there. You just start encountering people where you go. And so it's I guess it's images, memories that come up now when I read these things that are very different. Like I say, even the topography, I would have read these things before I'd been there. I just always thought of deserty, Middle Eastern, dry kinds of climates. And then I go there and realize, no, they're not like that at all. They're a lot more like what I know here. I'm from Colorado originally, and much of Turkey reminds me of Colorado, the plains, the wheat fields, snow-capped mountains. And so I feel more at home there in some way after having been there. But it really just makes it all seem more realistic to travel there. And now when I read these things and revisit these things, I have images and memories that immediately come to mind when I think about that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, I certainly hope we can do a trip at some point, and maybe, as I'm thinking about, God willing, if I get to take a sabbatical someday, the camping trip across Turkey sounds pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah.
Pitching
a guy for you.
Paul did.
I've got a guy for you.
Okay. Someday I'll be working. I'll hope that my body keeps up with me. I can do that someday. That sounds incredible.
Last time we did Turkey, we figured on the bus, we covered 2,300 miles.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It's a big place.
All right. Well, anything else, gentlemen? I want to leave a little bit of time just for sharing in prayer. But any other parting thoughts or questions for, Brian?
I had a question. I was struck by your use of the word ecumenical, Dr. Poe, when you were talking about the Council of Nicaea.
Right.
And that word in my mind, nowadays, of course, we have very distinct outlined varieties of Christianity. But in the 3rd century, I always kind of thought of it as sort of monolithic, but obviously that wasn't the case. But were there well-defined groups or differences that were recognized between groups of Christians at that time?
It's a good question, and not in the same sense we have today, no. And when at that point, when they said they're going to call an ecumenical council, what that meant is they were going to call all the leaders from the entire Mediterranean world together, from all the churches. So it really means more like little c Catholic than anything else, just that it's basically all the community of believers. And that's what made it so significant. It was because it really was the first time you had bishops from North Africa, Spain, Italy, Greece, Egypt, Israel, Antioch, all coming together really for the first time.
Wow.
And dealing with an issue that had created some division in the church at the time of trying to understand the nature of the divinity of Christ. And so it really was ecumenical in the sense of all the churches represented, but yeah, not in the sense of the diverse denominations like we have today, you know.
And Dr. Moore, correct me if I'm wrong, like I mean, I hate to use this word, but the heresy they were addressing, or what they decided was heresy, was a thing called Arianism, which was this idea that Jesus was a God, but he was kind of the first created thing, that God the Father and God the Son weren't the same, but they were actually separate gods. And that's why the Nicene Creed, they decided that was a heresy, that Jesus and God were, the same. And that's why the Nicene Creeds go to such pains to spell that out, light from light, very God from very God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. It's saying over and over and over again that Jesus was in fact kind of God in the flesh and not a separate God from God the Father. And that was like the big, that was the issue of the day that they were wrestling with.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
just look forward to, God willing, hearing from you more. And like I said, just deepening our connections with the amazing work you're doing at PBA. So thank you so much. And thanks, Dr. Saint Antoine, for setting it up.